This is a version of a talk that I gave to an audience at Streatley Parish Church in June 2023, and also a rather modified version of a similar talk I gave at St Michael's Church in November 2022. It's entitled Driven to Destruction: Is Environmentally and Climate-Friendly Transport Possible? It was delivered as part of the Eco Week at Streatley. First of all, though, I need to be positive. A lot of the talk will sound very negative, but I need to begin in a positive way by saying that modern transport systems have led to major benefits for individuals and societies, as resulting in a growth of trade and of commerce, increased access to education and to employment, accessibility for disadvantaged groups, particularly the disabled and the elderly, who have far more mobility than they used to have, opportunities for broadening experience more generally. But it comes with a range of environmental disbenefits. Poor air quality, to begin with, results from a lot of our transportation system. Noise, various health issues, safety issues, social exclusion and poverty issues, land use issues, and general congestion. All of these I'll be unpacking a little later. It also leads most to carbon dioxide emissions. Most modern transport modes rely on carbon-based fuels, and carbon dioxide is, of course, a greenhouse gas that contributes to global warming and climate change, and perhaps this latter effect is amongst the most important. But to give a little bit of background for myself, I'm an academic civil transport engineer working in environmental science on the borders of meteorology. And my main activity over many years has been working for and with the railways in Great Britain, particularly on the effects of weather extremes. And you can see a book myself and my co-worker have written there. So we've looked at wind effects on trains, extreme heat on track systems, and so on. I've also spent a lot of time working with agronomists looking at the effect of high wind on trees and crops. And more recently, I'm looking at the effect of tornado and thunderstorm loads on buildings. And so you can see that climate change is in some ways intrinsic to my academic and professional interest in terms of looking at the effects largely of wind on things, buildings and other bodies. I have another background, however. The background to this slide is the Easter Garden at St Michael's Church in Lichfield. I am actually an Anglican church clergyman, and as such I have a concern for future generations. I'm a long-term public transport user, and I have a certain theological motivation that I'm not going to unpick to any great extent in this talk, but could be considered under the headings of stewardship of the created world, the effect of climate change on the poorest, the necessity of neighbour love, and the whole large-scale issue of incarnation and atonement and how that applies to the concepts of creation and new creation. But that is for a separate presentation, I think. But you can see where I'm coming from, my background. In this talk, I'm going to be then talking about transport environmental issues, climate change, trends and targets, and then thinking about how we might move towards an environmentally and climate-friendly transport system, what we can do about these effects, and what can the church do about these effects. So let's have a quick resume of transportation environmental issues. Obviously, one of the major ones is air quality, and there we see on the right an air quality plot of central London showing very high levels in the centre. Air quality issues are mainly related to the oxides of nitrogen, and particular NO2, and particulate emissions from transport that can lead to respiratory health effects. NO2 comes from vehicle exhausts, particulates from vehicle exhaust, and from brakes and road wear. And it's estimated that somewhere between 28 and 36,000 deaths per year are due to air pollution. And most of the effects, a large proportion of them, come from inner city areas where the most deprived people live, and children are particularly vulnerable in those areas. Not just roads, however. This is a picture showing some experiments I and others carried out at Birmingham New Street in 2016, where we looked at pollution levels in New Street. Those of you who've been there will know that they were very high. The little picture at the top is a picture of the concentration of nitrogen dioxide over the course of a day. That red line shows the official limit, and you can see it was exceeded most of the time. Things have improved significantly since then with the various actions that Network Rail have undertaken. One side effect of transportation are a series of health issues. People tend to use their cars for very short journeys, and that doesn't help with the obesity issues that we have in this country. And overall, there are about 30,000 obesity deaths per year. More recently, particulate matter caused by transportation has been linked to dementia. And what you breathe as a child can have a significant effect on how you end your life. There's also an issue of social exclusion and poverty. Whilst about 40% of houses have one car and 33% have one car and 40% have two cars, only about 20% actually have no car at all. And these people tend again to be in the less well-off, deprived areas where public transport is poor, and if you can't get about, then that's one of the measures of social deprivation, one of the measures of causing urban areas to decay. So a side effect of our transportation system is to force a significant part of our population into some level of social exclusion and poverty. Then there is the issue of land use. Transportation takes a quite incredible amount of land in the UK. In the UK, we've got about 8.1% of our land that's developed. Of that, 3.7% of the total is dedicated to highways and road transport. That's a staggering proportion. And of that, parking, coping with transport when it's stationary, is 1 to 1.5%. Other transport, rail, trams and so on, only amounts to about 0.4%. So there's a tremendous land use issue there. Safety, of course, is a major issue, and there are about 1,800 deaths per year in the UK. And you can add a naught to that if you're thinking about the number of serious injuries that occur. Okay, so that's looked at some of the localized transport environmental issues. Let's think a bit more about the bigger picture about climate change. This graph shows the temperature over the course of 500 million years as assessed by a whole range of sources from ice cores, tree rings and so on. All relative to the average temperature of the 1950s. About 500 million years ago, which was the age of the amphibian, it can be seen the temperature was wildly variable, but generally a lot hotter than now. 160 million years ago, during the reign of the dinosaurs, the temperature was again very significantly higher than it is now. The temperature reduced somewhat into 10 to 20 million years ago, and here we find the first mammals and the first primates. About a thousand years, a million years before present, saw the emergence of Homo, and there we have Homo erectus, one of the first human species, followed by Cro-Magnon, reaching the pinnacle of the evolutionary scale in Homo sapiens sapiens, or perhaps not. That graph shows in the last few years where the axis changes from a logarithmic to a natural axis. It actually shows the ice ages that we can see very clearly. And perhaps more importantly, it shows over the last 10,000 years, the climate has been remarkably stable up until the last 20 or 30 years. And that's really quite important because over that period, civilization has developed. And so our civilization has developed in an era of climate stability. And we're now heading towards an era of climate instability. If we zoom in on that and look at the temperature over the last 1700 years, we can see that change very clearly indeed over the last few decades. The next graphic is, I think, a particularly telling one. It shows the temperature month by month from about 1880. And you can see that from that period through, as we'll see, to about the 1980s, there's a level of stability of temperature. The scale is in Fahrenheit, I'm afraid, there, because it's an American graphic and they still use that. As we begin to move up to more recent decades, we can begin to see a pushing out of this envelope, which starts to become pronounced in the 1880s and even more pronounced as we come into the 1990s and this current century, until when we come to very close to the present, we can see very high temperatures indeed. That, I think, is a very telling graphic. We live in a time of rapidly increasing temperatures. Many scientists have looked at this and carried out some large-scale computer simulations of physical processes, and fundamentally those current trends can only be explained if human sources of carbon dioxide are included. It's not quite so straightforward. There are natural occurrences of carbon dioxide that don't seem to have a great deal of effect. The greenhouse gases, the carbon dioxide we produce, is shown by the red shading, and that has a large effect, but that's actually ameliorated by some extent due to the fact that we also produce aerosols, which tends to shelter the earth from sunlight and so reduce the temperature a bit. But if you put the two together, we see the grey areas, and that pretty much matches our current observations. So the conclusion is, and it's a very firm scientific conclusion, that human effects in producing greenhouse gases are leading to rapid temperature rise. How will it affect us? It will affect us by increased climatic variability in terms of rainfall, in terms of heat. That picture on the right shows the heat wave of 2022. Sea level rise is going to happen because of glacial melt, and that's already built in. There's nothing we can do about that. That's going to happen now. And those are the areas of Western Europe that are currently above sea level that won't be in about 30 or 40 years' time. Now, I would suggest it's not a good time to buy a house in the Fenlands. It will also be affected on a wider sense. Crop failure in Europe and elsewhere because of excess heat might well lead to food supply issues. Excessive heat will cause significant health effects, significant deaths. This odd-looking island is actually the Birmingham conurbation. And what the picture on the left shows is the excess temperature within the conurbation in comparison to the outside rural areas. And you can see the red, that's several degrees centigrade, is an area in the city centre which is much hotter than the surrounding areas. The white at the top is Sutton Park, which is actually very close to Streatley, where I delivered this talk, so that's not too bad at all. You can also map in the second picture the places where vulnerable people live, the old, the infirm, the unemployed, and you can see again patches in the urban areas. If you put these together to actually look at the risk of health defects, you can see that most of these tend to concentrate in inner city Birmingham, where the most vulnerable people live and where the effects are highest. Much of this excess temperature within urban areas is caused by the heating due to transport. It's going to lead to climate change, is going to lead to increased storminess, and will lead to more cyclones and to floods. And we're going to see major migration from equatorial areas. This is always a political hot potato. It will become, I think, one of the dominant discourses in politics over the next few decades as people move away from equatorial areas. So, having looked at transport environmental issues and climate change, we move on to think briefly about trends and targets. If we think about international CO2 emissions, they've obviously been going up. The current level is 35 billion tonnes per year. Hold on to that figure and compare it with what follows. If we split up by sector, by industrial sector, electricity generation, manufacturing, buildings and so on, we find that transport contributes 8 billion tonnes, about a quarter, just under a quarter of the total. Of that, international shipping gives us 0.75 billion, international aviation gives us 1 billion. So about 2 billion comes from international shipping and aviation, a quarter of the entire transport emissions, which is about a quarter of the overall emissions. If we look at Britain, it looks actually quite encouraging in some ways. Goes to about 0.4 billion and has been steadily falling. Part of that is actually because we tend to export many of our emissions by buying from elsewhere. But nonetheless, it's encouraging. And across most of the sectors in Britain, the emissions are falling, apart from the transport sector, which stubbornly remains constant and is not falling at all, and indeed is now the dominant source of carbon emissions in this country at 0.13 billion, so 33% of the total. It's significant. If we think about emissions by different modes, we find that the most economic modes are international rail, national rail. The least best modes that produce most emissions are domestic flights or petrol or diesel medium-sized cars, and short-haul flights also are bad. And we can develop a hierarchy of what's good or bad. The good includes electric cars, but there are reservations I'll talk about later, international and domestic rail, and also cycling and walking, of course. The bad, international flights, the sort of car journeys we use most of the time, and large trucks. And the ugly is short haul and domestic flights are really not very friendly at all in terms of the production of carbon. If we look at emissions by different modes and see how they vary, this is for Britain, we can see that the figure is dominated by cars and taxis, light vans and heavy goods vehicles. All the others tend to pale into insignificance in comparison to that. We have in this country a set of targets, a UK set of targets for net zero by 2050, similar but bit different in the devolved administrations. Uh, this is the UK target, where it should be. We are not going to hit zero by 2050 unless we do something about transport, which is at the point that you can see it there. Will be the thing that stops us achieving that goal. But things aren't going particularly well. There are continuing trends for new car-dependent estates to be built. The one on the left is a very nice estate in Lichfield. It's being built to and effectively built in car dependency for the next 40 or 50 years. Very little opportunity for public transport. And shopping malls and hospitals continue to be built. The one on the right is the one that one of my friends and colleagues refers to as Merry Hell in the Black Country. Road building continues, despite growing doubts about the adequacy of the measures that are used to assess carbon emissions from that result from road building schemes. Road building, it is known, does not improve congestion. It just increases the amount of traffic. But these are the methods that are currently used within government. So, can we move towards an environmentally and climate-friendly transport system? What tools do we have that might enable us to do this? Well, firstly, what are the basic things that we need to achieve? The priorities are effectively threefold. First of all, a reduction of fossil fuel transport emissions that reduces carbon emissions. Secondly, a modal change to public transport, a reduction of private vehicle use. And thirdly, the encouragement of active travel, cycling and walking. While these will all remove carbon emissions, moving this way also improves air quality, it also improves noise levels, mitigates against health effects, and generally helps with all the other environmental effects as well. So in this way, solving climate change and solving local environmental effects comes to pretty much the same thing. You might say we have a technical fix of remote working, and that is true, and we've all grown very used to Zoom and Teams over the lockdown in the pandemic. It's not quite so simple though. If we plot the usage of rail and tube and road since the pandemic, and this only goes up to the end of middle of 22, I think, then we can see that the usage of these different modes are very similar to the pre-pandemic usage. It seems that people actually need to meet and talk to each other, and that, I think, is one of the lessons we've learned from the whole lockdown process. We've got the technical fix of electric vehicles. We can now buy electric cars, we can charge them, and that picture on the left is an experimental electric vehicle in Sweden with a pantograph that takes electricity from the overhead wires. Electric bikes and scooters are becoming increasingly common in some cities in the UK, and again, there's a growth in the number of charging points available. But one has to ask, where is that power coming from? It will need, if the power isn't that is actually used to charge up the batteries in electric cars, isn't from green energy sources, then we're overall gaining nothing. So we need to be thinking about a very significant increase in solar and wind. And that is happening. There is a huge increase in solar and wind coming, but there are certain structural issues. Solar and wind is become very much a political hot potato, and many people don't like living near solar or wind farms, and indeed at the moment in the UK wind farms on land are effectively banned. And then there is the issue of batteries. Electric cars require lithium batteries. Lithium, the extraction of it, is far from environmentally friendly. And electric cars are still, of course, still produce particulates from road wear and the like. The other major constraint to a widespread adoption of electric cars, uh, renewable power in general, is the nature of the grid. Our power grid has been built actually around power stations to distribute energy from power stations, and to distribute energy from distributed sources, as they're called, of solar power and of wind power, actually requires a different sort of grid, a rebuild of the grid, and that is a huge, huge task. You might say we can use hydrogen vehicles with fuel cells whose only pollutant is water. We can, and they do work, but most hydrogen these days is produced from methane, and that releases carbon dioxide. So in the big picture, it's not terribly environmentally friendly. And of course, fossil fuel cars, e-fuel cars, hydrogen cars, and electric cars actually all produce the same amount of congestion and all produce the same level of deprivation indexes uh, unless we reduce their number. Some people would argue that we can actually decarbonise air power. I'm not convinced here. Icelandair plans to fly domestic carbon-free by 2030, the first national administration to do so. They'll be flying planes that look like that with capacities of maybe 50, 60 people for 30-minute journeys, because Iceland's not very big. And that's a sort of limit to the technology. Electric batteries can't deliver the power weight ratio that's required for large-scale aviation as things stand at the moment. Some other interesting things. France, for example, is requiring all large car parks to be covered by solar panels, and that's a nice idea. And in some parts of the world, um, these are solar panels are used in agricultural areas for providing shelter for the flocks that graze beneath them. So it's a win-win situation there in that sort of environment. Then there's the possibility of infrastructure change, of low traffic networks and congestion charges. Again, a political hot potato. Uh, there is a concerted political move against LTNs and congestion charge areas in London, here in Birmingham. And yet, when they're imposed and when they've been in place for a year, nobody ever wants to get rid of them. They've become very, very popular. In the town where I live, in Lichfield, there is currently a trial of a fully pedestrianised city centre, which has produced a very pleasant environment in the city centre. Unfortunately, there is still a significant number of drivers who insist on driving through. It's not being terribly well pleased. And there is the Birmingham low emission zone, again, that's met with very considerable political opposition. I find it very odd that many environmental improvements have become politically polarized. What to me is simple common sense has become a marker of one's political affiliations, for good or for ill. Um, we can look towards infrastructure change by improving public transport to encourage modal shift. And there we have a combined tram train station on the Midland Metro. We can think about moving people onto the railways, but here we hit a problem again because GB railways are pretty much at capacity, and that means there needs to be significant modal shift. If you're going to get it, it requires new build, and that is what HS2 is all about. HS2 is currently in the political wilderness, of course, may or may not get built. But here, I'm afraid, the Green Party is in terrible confusion. They really are vehemently against HS2, but yet want to encourage modal shift to the railways. They have, as I say, a very incoherent policy here that really rather discredits much of what they do. We can think about infrastructure change, building cycleways, using cargo bikes to for many a large proportion of the journeys in this country that are below about 5 kilometres, and that is actually the large majority of journeys. And this gives me an opportunity to show some of my favourite cycleways, which can be a source of some amusement to people. Obviously designed by perhaps people I've lectured over the last 40 years in civil engineering who really haven't got a clue what it means to cycle, but they're nonetheless quite fun to look at in some of them. That last one, I don't know how quite one is intended to get to that cycleway. And perhaps this one, though, is my favourite of them all. Again, probably put in place on a map by somebody who's never actually visited the site. Okay, so that's looking at what we can do about moving towards an environmentally and climate-friendly transport system. What can we do about it as individuals? We can think about behavioural change, about car sharing, about car clubs, about active travel, modal shift. We can perhaps carry out a personal and household travel audit. What should we, where are we producing carbon? How can that be reduced? We can think about walking and cycling more. Very helpful in lots of ways. We can use electric vehicles, but beware of the caveats that I gave earlier. Use public transport more, vehicle sharing and car clubs. Strongly urge people to avoid all domestic flights, to take surface transport instead of near Europe short-haul flights. Think very, very carefully before making any long-haul flights. But I acknowledge, and that also reduce purchases that require long-distance shipping insofar as one can, although one doesn't tend to know that stuff on Amazon is coming from China until one has actually ordered it. But it's not easy. In this country, there is poor public transport in comparison to many countries, and a disinterested government, it has to be said. Cycling and walking can be dangerous, and the infrastructure is poor. So it is not easy in our current state to make many of these personal changes to the way we live. I think we need to be honest about that and not beat ourselves up about it overmuch. But what can we do? One of the things we can do is advocacy. We've seen in the recent months some very high-profile activists from Just Stop Oil, Insulate Britain, and so on, causing very significant disruption. I can understand the feelings of these people and I can very much sympathise with them. I don't think actually at the moment these methods are actually productive. They tend to antagonise rather than anything else, but I do sympathise with their motivation. I think we need to advocate in whatever way we can through joining specific organisations, through writing to MPs, writing to councillors for improved public transport and bus and rail, for home and commercial insulation, for solar and wind power, for better pedestrian and cycling infrastructure, and for building on brownfield sites with good public and active travel facilities, and for the relocation of out-of-town facilities back into town centres and to restrict the number of road schemes. Again, this is a very political set of actions that we need, I believe, if we're going to change things, to engage in. And finally, as this is delivered in a church setting, what can the church do about these effects? Well, the church can first of all acknowledge the issue, and to some degree it has. It's produced a route map to the net zero by 2030. Highly idealistic. There is not the faintest hope of getting there, even in its own terms, by 2030. And if you do a quick search on it, you find that transport is mentioned perhaps once or twice, and never have the effects of transport on carbon emissions been taken into account. And yet, If you do a church travel audit, as I did for our church, St Michael on Greenhill in Lichfield in 2018, we find that if we calculate the amount of CO2 production, in total we're producing 33 tonnes, of which transport is 40% of the total. And that is just simply people getting to church and doing church business. A huge amount of the total is produced by transport, rather more than nationally, it has to be said. Yet, church organisation, although it needs to take account of transport, carbon emissions and all aspects of church life, doesn't. It proceeds to adopt pastoral reorganisation that sees a thinning of churches and that requires more and more transport between worship centres. It provides meeting venues that, such as in my diocese in Lichfield, that are very difficult to get to by public transport. Service times and venues aren't public transport friendly. There aren't many places in this country that have buses that can get you to a service at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning. But also in church terms, we need, I think, to remember fundamentally what we're about. One of the tools that we do have in this is prayer. St. Paul writes, "For our struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." There is an element in which the fight against environmental degradation and climate change has a spiritual aspect, where the church and society are to some degree bound by these cosmic powers of this present age, the spiritual forces of evil, and that need to be prayed against. So, to ask the questions, is climate friendly transport possible? Is environmentally friendly transport possible? And the answer basically is it's complicated. In climate terms, yes, I think we can develop a climate friendly transport, but a significantly increased renewable generating capacity is required. Is environmentally friendly transport possible? And that's more difficult and requires significant changes in society and individuals to move away from our culture of car dependency. And there's an overarching issue here that in our country we do not have a overall transport policy that could be used to begin to work across sectors to improve transport emissions, to mitigate against adverse environmental effects. And that perhaps is one of the real political needs that we have in this country, is to develop some sort of policy that can bring together different government departments, different local authorities, and have coherent multi-sectorial objectives to make things better. But I finish here. Thank you for listening. And I finish with a cartoon with someone saying, what if we do all these things and it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? I'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for listening.